It was a crisp, clear morning in the small town of Middleton, where life moved at its own pace. The streets were lined with modest homes, and the hum of daily routines filled the air. Amidst this quiet, two sisters, Tiana and Diana Carter, stood out, not just because they were identical twins, but because they carried themselves with a quiet strength that few could explain. Both in their early 20s, they had recently moved to Middleton to escape the chaos of city life, hoping for peace and a fresh start. But peace can be deceptive, especially when prejudice and ignorance lurk in the shadows. The sisters were as different in personality as they were alike in appearance. Tiana, with her sharp wit and a protective streak, was the one who always noticed the little things, the way someone's tone shifted when they spoke, or the quick glances exchanged across a room. Ayana, on the other hand, was calm and measured, the kind of person who could diffuse tension with a single disarming smile. Together, they were inseparable, their bond unbreakable. The town's residents had varying reactions to the new arrivals. Some were welcoming, offering friendly waves and kind words. Others, however, weren't so subtle in their disapproval. Middleton, for all its charm, had an undercurrent of hostility that reared its head in quiet ways. A door that closed too quickly behind them, whispers that followed them in grocery aisles, or the way certain faces hardened when they walked by. It was at the local diner, a cornerstone of the community, where things began to unravel. The sisters had been coming there for breakfast every Saturday morning, enjoying the buttery pancakes and strong coffee. The staff was polite, if a bit distant, and the sisters kept to themselves, grateful for the semblance of normalcy. But this Saturday was different. As they walked in, laughter erupted from a booth near the back. A group of men, 5 of them, sat sprawled across the seats, their presence impossible to ignore. They weren't regulars. Tiana and Ayana would have remembered them. Dressed in leather jackets and faded jeans, they exuded an air of intimidation, the kind that made the other diners keep their heads down and their eyes averted. The sisters tried to ignore the group as they took their usual spot by the window, but the men didn't ignore them. "Hey, twins," one of them called out, his voice loud enough to silence the diner's low hum. "Lost, are we?" Chana stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Diana, who gently shook her head as if to say, "Don't engage." The man wasn't deterred by their silence. "What's wrong?" "Don't they teach manners where you're from?" A snicker came from another man at the booth. "Maybe they're just too good to talk to us. You know how some people are." The air grew thick, the tension palpable. Tiana's hands clenched under the table, her mind racing. She didn't want to cause a scene, but something about these men, about the way they looked at her and her sister, made her skin crawl. Ayana reached across the table and touched Tiana's arm, her voice low and steady. "Let it go. It's not worth it." But the men weren't done. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Another one sneered, his eyes dark and challenging. "Sitting there, like you're in the place." The diner's owner, an older man named Carl, approached the group, his face tight with unease. "That's enough," he said firmly. "You're disturbing my customers." The leader of the group smirked, leaning back in his seat. "We're just having a little fun, Carl. No harm in that, right?" Carl didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The men laughed, their voices echoing in the small space. Tiana and Ayana finished their meal quickly, their appetites soured. As they walked out, the men's laughter followed them, taunting and cruel. Tiana's jaw tightened, her fists clenched at her sides. "They don't know who they're messing with," she muttered under her breath. Ayana sighed, her gaze steady. "And they don't need to. Not yet." What the men, and everyone else in Middleton, didn't know was that Tiana and Ayana weren't just sisters trying to build a new life. They were 2 of the most elite soldiers the US military had ever trained. Their records were sealed, their missions classified. They had faced dangers most people couldn't fathom, survived situations that would have broken anyone else. And while they had left that life behind, their skills were as sharp as ever. As they walked down the quiet street, the sisters exchanged a look. a silent promise that they would handle things if they needed to. They had hoped for peace in Middleton, but if trouble came knocking, they were more than ready to answer. The morning air was crisp as Tiana and Ayana made their way back to their small rental house on the outskirts of town. The narrow streets were quiet, lined with rows of aging trees that swayed gently in the breeze. It was the kind of stillness they had craved after years of chaos, but today it felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The silence between them was unspoken understanding, a language they'd perfected over years of working side by side. Ayana finally broke it, her voice soft but firm. "We can't let people like that get to us," she said, glancing at her sister. Tiana shook her head, her jaw still tight. "It's not about getting to me. It's about knowing when to stand up for yourself." Ayana smiled faintly. "And sometimes standing up means staying silent. You taught me that." The comment made Tiana pause, her expression softening just a bit. She knew Ayana was right. There was a time and a place for everything. The key was knowing when to act and when to wait. The sisters reached their house, a modest single-story home with white siding and a neatly kept lawn. It was simple, but it was theirs for now, a quiet refuge they'd built from the ground up. Inside, the space was cozy, decorated with a mix of old furniture and personal touches that made it feel like home. Tiana dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and leaned against it, watching as Ayana opened a window to let in the fresh air. For a moment, the tension from the diner seemed to lift, replaced by the warm familiarity of their shared space. "You think those guys are going to let it go?" Tiana asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ayana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, the sound of the flame igniting filling the quiet. Finally, she turned to her sister. "People like that don't usually stop unless someone makes them," she said evenly. "But that doesn't mean we have to be the ones to do it. Not yet." Tiana let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You always make it sound so easy." "It's not easy," Ayana said with a shrug. "It's just necessary." The kettle whistled, and Ayana poured the hot water into 2 mugs, setting one in front of Tiana. The simple gesture brought a sense of calm, a reminder of the countless times they'd sat together like this, strategizing their next move. As they sipped their tea, the sisters' thoughts drifted back to the past, back to the life they'd left behind. Few people knew the truth about Tiana and Ayana. To the outside world, they were just 2 young women trying to make a new start in a quiet town. But beneath the surface, their lives had been anything but ordinary. They had grown up in a strict military family, their father a decorated officer who had instilled discipline and resilience in them from a young age. While other kids played in parks or watched cartoons, Tiana and Ayana were learning survival tactics, practicing drills, and mastering skills that most adults would never need. It wasn't a surprise when both sisters enlisted straight out of high school. What did surprise everyone, including their superiors, was just how exceptional they were. They quickly rose through the ranks, earning a reputation for their unmatched precision, intelligence, and ability to work as a seamless team. Their success didn't go unnoticed. By their mid-20s, they were recruited into an elite, covert unit, soldiers trained to handle the missions no one else could. Their identities were classified, their operations buried under layers of secrecy. They had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine, each mission leaving its mark in ways they rarely talked about. But that life came at a cost. After a particularly harrowing mission, the kind that haunted their dreams and weighed heavy on their souls, the sisters made a pact. They would leave that world behind, find a way to live a life that was quieter, simpler. A life where they could just be Tiana and Ayana, not soldiers or operatives or weapons. Middleton had seemed like the perfect place for that. Small, unassuming, and far removed from the chaos they were used to. For the first few weeks, it almost felt like it could work. They spent their days gardening, exploring the nearby woods, and slowly becoming part of the community. But now, as the memory of the men in the diner lingered, the sisters couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. Tiana stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "You know this isn't going to end here," she said softly. Ayana joined her, leaning against the frame. "No, it won't," she agreed. "But when it doesn't, we'll be ready." The confidence in Ayana's voice was steadying, but it didn't erase the tension in Tiana's chest. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her that something wasn't right. Later that night, as darkness settled over the town, Tiana and Ayana sat on the porch, the cool air wrapping around them like a blanket. The stars were bright, and the world seemed peaceful. But beneath the surface, both sisters were on edge, their senses heightened in a way that only came from years of training. They didn't talk much, their silence filled with unspoken thoughts. Tiana kept her eyes on the tree line in the distance, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't stop thinking about the men in the diner, the way they had looked at her and Ayana, the way their words had carried a subtle, simmering threat. Ayana, sitting beside her, seemed calm, but Tiana knew better. Her sister's stillness wasn't indifference, it was preparation. When the sound came, it was faint but unmistakable. A car engine idling somewhere down the street. Tiana's muscles tensed, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows. Ayana heard it too, her head tilting slightly as she listened. "They're testing us," Tiana said quietly, her voice low. Ayana nodded. "They don't know who they're testing." The car didn't move for a long time, the headlights off, blending into the dark. It was a tactic the sisters recognized, one meant to intimidate without making an outright move. Finally, the engine revved, and the car disappeared into the night, leaving the street silent once more. Tiana exhaled, her jaw tight. "They're going to push," she said, "and when they do." "We'll handle it," Ayana finished, her voice steady. As they sat in the dark, the sisters knew that their quiet life in Middleton was about to change. The peace they had worked so hard to find was slipping away, and the storm that was coming would force them to confront the part of themselves they had tried to leave behind. The only question now was how far things would go, and who would regret crossing them first. The following days passed in a strange limbo, a tense silence settling over Middleton. Tiana and Ayana kept to their routine, going about their errands, keeping their heads down, and trying to act as though everything was normal. But the unease lingered, an invisible weight they both felt but didn't openly discuss. It was in the small moments, the way Tiana's eyes scanned every room they entered, or how Ayana lingered just a little longer at the windows, watching the streets. They both knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. The men from the diner weren't just passing through, they were staying in town. The group had taken up residence at a rundown motel on the outskirts, the kind of place where people came and went without asking questions. Their presence hadn't gone unnoticed. At the diner, Carl, the owner, mentioned it casually when the sisters came in for coffee one morning. "They've been causing trouble," he said, wiping down the counter. "Loud parties at the motel, drinking too much, that kind of thing. Sheriff's already been out there twice this week." Ayana nodded, her expression calm. "Do you think they're here for a reason, or just passing through?" Carl shrugged, glancing around the empty diner before leaning in a little closer. "I don't know, but they're not the kind of folks you want to get involved with. Something about them feels off." Tiana didn't say anything, but her jaw tightened. She could feel it too, that undercurrent of menace that hung around the group like a storm cloud. Later that day, as the sisters walked through the small farmers' market in town, they noticed the men again. This time, they weren't trying to hide their attention. Leaning against their truck, parked near the edge of the lot, they watched Tiana and Ayana with lazy smirks, their laughter carrying just far enough to make their presence known. Ayana nudged Tiana gently as they passed a stand selling fresh apples. "Don't react," she said quietly. "I'm not," Tiana replied through gritted teeth, her hand tightening around the handle of the bag she was carrying. But it wasn't easy. The men's laughter followed them like a shadow, grating against her nerves. Tiana's instincts screamed at her to do something, to act, but she held herself in check. She knew Ayana was right. This wasn't the time. Still, The encounter left them both on edge. Back at home, the tension boiled over. "We can't just keep ignoring them," Tiana said, pacing the living room. "They're pushing. Ayana, they want a reaction." "I know," Ayana said, sitting on the edge of the couch, her voice calm but firm. "And that's exactly why we can't give them one. Not yet." Shiana stopped and looked at her sister, frustration clear in her eyes. "So what do we do? Just let them keep following us, keep pushing until they finally cross the line." Ayana stood, meeting her sister's gaze. "We wait. We watch. And when they cross that line, we'll be ready." It wasn't the answer Tiana wanted, but she knew Ayana was right. Acting too soon could escalate things in a way they couldn't control. As the days went on, the tension in town began to ripple outward. People started to notice the men's presence more. Their loud behavior, their crude comments, the way they seemed to linger in places they didn't belong. Whispers spread, rumors growing with each retelling. One afternoon, Chenna was at the local hardware store picking up supplies when she overheard a conversation between two older women. "They were hanging around the school yesterday," one of them said, her voice low. "Made the teachers nervous. The sheriff had to come down and talk to them." "They're looking for trouble," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "I don't know why people like that come to a place like this." Shana clenched her jaw, pretending to browse a shelf of tools as the women continued talking. Her stomach churned at the thought of the men near the school. It wasn't just about her and Ayana anymore. These men were becoming a threat to the whole town. That night, as the sisters sat on the porch again, Chana told Ayana what she'd heard. "They're not just messing with us," she said, her voice low. "They're pushing their way into everything." Ayana nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's what people like them do. They test boundaries until someone pushes back." "And what happens when no one does?" Tiana asked. Ayana didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out into the dark, her gaze thoughtful. "Then it's up to us." The unspoken truth hung between them. They had tried to leave their old lives behind, but the skills they had, the instincts that had been drilled into them, weren't something they could turn off. And as much as they wanted to blend into this quiet town, they couldn't ignore what was happening around them. The next day brought another confrontation, one that pushed the tension closer to the breaking point. The sisters were walking back from the grocery store when they saw one of the men, the one who had spoken first at the diner, standing by their house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, watching them with a smug grin. Shiana stopped in her tracks, her fists clenching. Ayana placed a hand on her arm, but it wasn't enough to stop her from marching forward. "What are you doing here?" Tiana demanded, her voice sharp. The man chuckled, straightening up but not moving from his spot. "Just taking a walk. Nice neighborhood you've got here." "You don't belong here," Tiana said, her tone ice cold. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Neither do you." Before Tiana could respond, Ayana stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You need to leave." The man looked at her, his grin faltering for just a second before he chuckled again. "Or what?" Ayana didn't blink. "You don't want to find out." Something in her tone made the man hesitate just for a moment. Then he shrugged, holding up his hands as if in surrender. "Relax. I'm just passing through," he said, climbing back into his truck. "See you around." As the truck disappeared down the street, Tiana turned to Ayana, her frustration boiling over. "We can't keep letting them do this." "We won't," Ayana said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But when we make our move, it'll be on our terms, not theirs." Tiana wanted to argue, but she knew her sister was right. They had faced bigger threats than this before, and they had always come out on top. They just had to wait, to plan, to be ready. But deep down, Tiana couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the cost of waiting might be higher than they were prepared to pay.